The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke this parable to his disciples. The kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here is the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came. Those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Lord Jesus Christ.
There was a song that became popular during the First World War. I hope I'm not dating myself here. But it was called "Keep the Home Fires Burning." It was a song that was meant to boost the morale of the civilian population of England at a time when that country was in anguish over the fate of its soldiers engaged in a very gruesome war. The casualty rate due to the new developed weapons at that time and the poor sanitary conditions in the trenches and the battlefields was great and nearly wiped out a whole generation of young men. It was truly a dark and challenging time for both those on the war front and on the home front. Now, I think the relevance of that song is not lost on us, not only as we approach Remembrance Day, but because of the darkness that the COVID virus has cast over our world this year. As during wartime, sometimes victory seems far off and people become weary and fatigued. The scary thing in these situations is that the mental and psychological distress of social isolation and fear begins to take its toll, and the lamps of people's hopes begin to flicker and in some cases go out completely. So today's gospel might be a very fitting reading. What will keep our home fires of hope burning as we struggle through these days? And what will be the fuel that keeps our lamps alit? Now, generations born after World War II, which includes probably many of us, have never personally known the sacrifices that people had to make, both at home and on the battlefield during those cataclysmic times. Remember my folks telling me about the rationing of food and gasoline and so many other things that we take for granted. And the sacrifices, that they had to make. Well, perhaps this year, 2020, will test the mettle of us at this present time. And there was a saying, which I think came out of World War II, that said, "There are no atheists in foxholes. Foxholes were those little ditches that soldiers dug on the battlefield to protect themselves from the bullets and the ammunition being fired at them and the shrapnel from exploding bombs and so on. There are no enemies in foxholes. In other words, whenever we get in close touch with our mortality, we often retreat to a faith that we sometimes have put on a back burner. Why then does it take a war or a natural disaster or a pandemic to draw people back to faith? Why does it take a fear factor to help us acknowledge our dependency on God? And why indeed do we allow our faith lamps to go out because we have fallen asleep in our self-securities and our entitlement attitudes? Our first reading today praises the gift of wisdom. It's the wise person who keeps the bigger picture in mind. Life is not always about me and my particular agendas. It's about how I can pour out something of my life for the greater good, as Christ poured out and emptied his life for all of us. You know, at this time, we're called to set aside some of the things that perhaps we have taken for granted, something of the privileges that we have enjoyed, to make a few sacrifices like having to wear these masks, restricting our social gatherings, not being able to visit with some of our elders, maybe our parents or grandparents. We need to keep in mind that we do this not only for our own protection, but for the protection of others. And we do these things no matter how inconvenient and tedious they might be, because they are the small sacrifices that we are called to make at this time, just as past generations had to make sacrifices in their day as well. Perhaps the masks that we don today are kind of like the poppies that we wear on Remembrance Day. It was Prime Minister Winston Churchill who said in the middle of the London Blitz in 1940, when the bombs were dropping on London, that history would regard it as England's finest hour. The lamps of steadfastness and resolve on the part of the British population at that time were not to be extinguished, and proved that cooperation and self-sacrifice would ultimately triumph. The fuel that keeps the hopes of our home fires burning is that of love. It's the ultimate motivation that allows us to make the kinds of sacrifices required of us at any particular time and situation. It is love that comes under the guise of sacrifice and self-giving that fuels the lamps of hope and the anticipation of the coming of the bridegroom, Christ himself. Hopefully, we can prove to be like the wise bridesmaids of Jesus' parable, who kept the oil of gladness and hope alive and enough to maintain our lamps during these challenging days. So that when we look back on this, we can see that it was one of our finer hours as well, because we were able to make those sacrifices, because we were able to do the things that needed to be done. And so today, as we ponder the gospel reading today and our scripture readings on this Sunday, we ask that God will give us the resolve and the strength, indeed, to do what needs to be done, to keep our lamps lit of hope and to encourage with one another. The other day, I was listening to a story about a family, a native family from Saskatchewan, whose, I believe, great uncle had died in World War I. He didn't need to serve, and in fact, a lot of the Native people who did serve in the army during the First and Second World Wars were never really compensated as much as some other soldiers were. But they went anyway, and they made the sacrifice, and in this case, it was a total sacrifice. And it was the first time in 100 years that the family were able to visit the grave of their great uncle, located in a cemetery, military cemetery in France. And they told the story that was handed down that that when he went over to fight, he just told everybody to keep their chins up. And that might seem like a rather trivial thing to say, but I think, for somebody who was entering a very dangerous situation as he was entering, it was a heroic thing to say. He said that to the people who would remain at home, but he was the one that was making the ultimate sacrifice. So perhaps maybe we keep that in mind, whenever we feel inconvenienced or troubled or isolated, that we encourage one another to keep our chins up, because indeed our faith in God, a God who walks with us and God who is always with us, is indeed a person who loves us very much and who will never abandon us. As we celebrate the Eucharist today, let us keep that in mind as we journey on together as a faith community, a community that indeed keeps the lamps of our faith and our hopes very much alight. Amen.